Hello all and welcome back. In this lecture, we are going to learn about implementing Azure Active Directory, and we are going to have a look on key components that are required in terms of the architecture of Azure Active Directory. And then we are going to jump into the Azure portal to create our own Azure Active Directory tenant. I didn't talk about the tenant, what it means, so I'm going to talk in this lecture what exactly tenant means and the relationship and how you can actually associate your Azure tenant with your actual domain name by registering by creating within your GoDaddy or whatever the public DNS uh, the required MX or TXT records so that you prove yourself that you really own that specific tenant. So, so let's think about what are the basic component vocabulary that you need to know with the help of this lecture. So the first one would be definitely a tenant. Without using a tenant word, you cannot learn the Azure Active Directory definitely. So what exactly is tenant? Tenant is actually representation of your entire organization within the Azure Active Directory terms. So let's try to understand more about this tenant. Let's say you have maybe a user account or maybe computers or maybe applications. So that needs to be managed or that needs to be registered somewhere for the access management. That's where we have the tenant comes into the picture. So tenant will host all the access management or identity specific information can be managed. So all about the Azure Active Directory will be in the backend. It's called the tenant. So you have the tenant. So let's take some of the examples of the tenant. So when you create a tenant, you actually get you need to fulfill with a unique name. For example, if it's your company name, so your company name dot on Microsoft.com. So that's the first domain on Microsoft.com, which is created by Microsoft. On top of it, you are actually creating a unique ID. For example, if I give my company name, let's say pavan.onmicrosoft.com, I can create as this a tenant. So post to that, I can add or I can create users or groups or register applications with specific to this tenant. You may be having a question that do I need to end with the same name format? No. So when you own your own domain name, let's say you have your company name.com, so you can actually map from your existing tenant name, that's pavan.onmicrosoft.com, to your company name.com. So for that what you have to do is you have to create a DNS records to prove that you really own this domain so that you can use the company .com or your company.com domain name. And the next thing is the word called association. This also sometimes referred as the trust relationship within the Azure Active Directory world. Let's say you have multiple subscriptions. Let's say one for the production, one for the development, one for maybe a specific team who's working on a sales or maybe a marketing department, and they have different servers, and all these servers are required to be managed for the building different building purpose. So you need to integrate your Azure Active Directory with those subscriptions so that you can actually apply all the conditions, all the access policies, or all the user accounts can be configured for granting the access for your Azure resources. So that's where the association comes into the picture. So you can do the association. That's nothing but a linking between your Azure tenant. This is the tenant, right? We talked about the on Microsoft.com with Azure subscriptions. So that can be done. I wanted to highlight one very important point here that's related to the subscriptions and tenants limitation. You can have one Azure Active Directory tenant can be associated with multiple subscriptions, but you cannot have the same subscription can be associated with multiple tenants. That's not possible. So each subscription can only associate with only one tenant. That's the outcome, and that's very important point here, so that you can easily understand further when it comes to the actual implementation within the Azure Active Directory architecture. Let's try to recap and then we try to understand by jumping into the Azure portal, by creating all these components that we have so far learned. So the first thing is we try to learn about in the previous lecture about Azure Active Directory, what it is, how it does or works. And within this lecture, we do understand that Azure Active Directory will have your users and groups and your registered application, and also you will have your registered devices, and that can be actually when you try to create Azure Active Directory, you have to create one tenant ID. So like a domain.onmicrosoft.com, and this must be a unique. So domain name is always changes here in your company name. Unique, definitely, right? So it can't be the same thing for somebody else. Let's say I work in IBM, so if I give as ibm.onmicrosoft.com, and you try with the same name ibm.onmicrosoft.com, it doesn't work. It says that it must be a unique. So you might go with ibm 01, even though your company name remains same. You might go for a multiple different unique tenant IDs. And finally, what also we learned within this lecture is we can actually, whatever we have the tenant ID, that can be mapped to your custom domain name by creating either a text record or MX record just to verify your domain name, that's your custom domain name.com, by logging into your GoDaddy or maybe wherever you have your domain name. There you simply have to create some of the DNS records so that you own that domain and you prove that, so that the users can log in with like username at customdomain.com. Let's say if the domain is IBM, so I can log in with my username at ibm.com. And similarly, if you don't verify, what would happen is you will log in with your username at the rate domain.onmicrosoft.com. Let's say if my domain or tenant ID is Pavan, so I give here as a Pavan like username Paddy as a username example, Paddy at pavan.onmicrosoft.com. So it's better to always validate your custom domain. Definitely in the real world, it's going to be validated with not just one domain. You might have more than one domain. So you can definitely do more than one domain verification for the same tenant. Let's say maybe you have a company called Tata. They're into maybe a software or hardware, or maybe Tata Motors, or maybe electronics, or maybe computers. So you have maybe 10 domains, but you can actually verify these 10 domains with a single tenant ID. So that's very much possible. And for that, all you have to do is you have to create that domain specific txt or mx specific records to be created with the value that was given in the Azure portal. Let's jump into association part. So as I said earlier, if you understand as till this point of time, subscriptions are completely different and there is no relation between the subscription and Azure Active Directory. So both are completely different. There's no relation by default. All you have to do is you have to relate your subscription with one of the tenant. Let's say, as we talked earlier, we have talked about a keyword here. If you can remember, the Azure Active Directory tenant can be associated with multiple subscriptions, but every subscription will have only one tenant. Let's say what it means is here, as we talked earlier, you have onboarded maybe a production and development different environments. So one for the production subscription, you may have an other one for the development subscription, but you will have only one tenant where your users are from this specific tenant as your Active Directory, and these users are registered the applications in production as well as in the development, and you can test with that as your subscription all the applications, and then if working everything fine, maybe you have a different mechanism to onboard them to production subscription. That's a different story. But here what you're trying to do is you are actually depending on a single Azure Active Directory tenant to manage multiple subscriptions. So you need to associate in such a way. So once I have associated, what would happen is I have maybe different subscription different resources. Let's say I may have Office 365 or maybe Dropbox or maybe different resources within my Azure subscription, all that can be used in order to grant the access for my different Azure resources. That's how it's going to work. Let's switch to Azure portal. Within the portal, you can click to Azure Active Directory, and if you see here, I have already a tenant. This is my tenant name, primary domain name. If you see PaddyMaddy lab dot on Microsoft.com, this is my tenant ID. So how would I create? So what you have to do is you have to click on Azure Active Directory. So when you don't have any tenant, simply go for Azure Active Directory and then click on tenant resource creation and then create a tenant. So this is a resource wizard which you need to follow. So within this you can give here name. So this is how, for example, here Paddy Lab is showing. So this is because the name of my organization as given as this. So let's say if I give here as my company representation, let's say I can give here IBM Demo Lab example, and I give here an initial domain name. If I try to give here as explained earlier IBM, and it's going to actually validate. If you see tick mark, similar tick mark, it's going to come if I just as soon as I move. So it's verifying here, and it says that already in use by another directory. So somebody has already taken definitely. So if I just give has 01, um, it might be already in use. If I just click on somewhere else, it's going to validate and says that it's already in use. So I can give here maybe my demo lab IBM 01 or something like that. It might be available because this name nobody takes, I guess. So you see it's available now. So now the next thing is the governance policies. So all these identity management solution specific data, where do you want to store? So if you are specific to your company is based on US, so it's always recommended you to put in the US. If it's from the European Union, so choose the relevant EU region. So in my case, I'll just stick to United States, and I'm going to review and then click on create. So it's going to create the Azure Active Directory tenant ID with this. So in a minute, I'm going to get this specific tenant. So until then, I'll just pause this video. Now we have successfully created tenant, and if you see here Paddy Lab, I'm still on a Paddy Lab. I need to switch back, so either I can click here so that it will take me to that specific resource. So I'll just click on that, so it's going to take me in a new tab to that specific tenant, and I should be able to get it here as that IBM demo lab or whatever the description I have given so far. So this the tenant. You can check out here. I got a different tenant ID, and this is the tenant ID as you call it as, you can call it as the unique identity for your tenant. So in a Microsoft terms, they actually don't look at on Microsoft.com. This is maybe a unique. Of course, this is unique, but in terms of the core, they always look for tenant ID in the backend. So they track based on the tenant ID, not on the primary domain name. But for us, primary domain name is very important here, or the tenant ID is very important here. And now let's see, if I want to create a user account, I can simply create a new user account. So the first account that we have created within this tenant is a Microsoft account, which is my Microsoft Hotmail account, which will be a by default the global administrator. That means I have a full rights. That's where I logged in with this account. Now if you try to create, you can choose your creation part. For example, I can go for maybe like, as I said, Chris, and I can choose here the tenant ID, so that users will always log in with a username that's a Chris @demolab IBM01 dot on Microsoft.com. Yes, it's very lengthy. That's where it comes that you to verify your domain. So if you could have already verified your tenant with a company domain name, you don't get that option. So you simply switch back with a username @yourcompany.com. Let's say if it's a company's IBM, IBM.com simply, and you can go for the full name and all that and auto registered, that would actually generate the password. And it also you can also choose the user's location where you want to store. For example, this is United States, the specific user, and create is going to create a user account in a minute. Once the user account is created, you can see here the source of the user account is from Azure Active Directory this time. So that's how it's going to work. So now we talked about the tenant and the domain. We didn't talk about. Now let's also look at the association part. So how do you associate? Simply you go to your Azure Active Directory and simply go to your subscription. So I'm just going to my subscriptions. I do have multiple subscriptions. So if you see here, I don't have any subscription for this specific tenant. So why is like this? Because you haven't yet associated anything with your tenant. So you need to associate. Similarly, if I just go back to my Azure portal and try to create a virtual machine, it says that hey, you don't have any subscription, so you cannot create any Azure resources. So all you have to do is, as I said, earlier, Azure subscription is completely different and Azure Active Directory is completely different. Both are two different entities within Microsoft Azure world. So you need to associate in order to get benefited with your subscription and Azure tenant ID. So as a next step, I have to switch it. So how do you switch is you have here the global filter. This is a global filter. This is where you can switch with all your directories. If you just click on all directories, it will list all the directories that you have within this ID which is associated. So you have here my tenant ID, or my directory is this uh, demo lab in IBM 01, which is currently we are working, and also lab in my lab. So different tenants I do have here. So that's the global filter. That's where you can filter, and you can also set when you log into Azure portal, by default it can point to a specific tenant directory by default. So for that you need to go to from the default directory. You can set as a default directory from your filter actually. And in my case I have already configured this. So as a next step I need to go and associate. So for that what I'm going to do is I'm actually switching back to my actual subscription. So this is where I have a subscription and also a tenant configured. So I'll just switch back here, and you can see it's opening in a new tab. And this is where we went earlier for creating a tenant. So let me go back to here and search for something called subscription. So if you try to search for the subscriptions, you might list here a different subscription. So I do have here an active subscription. So what I can do is I need to associate with this subscription with the account or with the tenant ID which we have just created. So we created earlier a different tenant, so that's where I'm going to associate. So to do that, just go to your select subscription. Maybe you have created your marketing subscription or sales subscription that you wanted to associate with tenant. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually in this phase now, tenant and tenant to be associated with one other subscription. So let's say this is a development subscription what I have currently logged in example. So what I'm going to do is I'll just go to my subscription overview and change directory. So what would happen is whatever the subscription you have here, this subscription, specific subscription, is going to be associated with a directory called a different directory. So in this case it's currently PaddyMaddy lab dot on Microsoft.com. So I don't want to associate with this. Instead, I want to associate with my current, which I have just created as part of this demo. For example, demo lab for the IBM specific tenant which I have created. So all you have to do is just click on to select directory and select the desired tenant. So in my case, IBM Demo Lab, this is the tenant ID. So I'll simply select and click on change. So that would take approximately 10 to 15 minutes in the backend to finish the entire mapping or association or the relationship to happen in the background. That's where you can use, then you can use by creating any of the resources because in your subscription, you might have the billing details, so you have different resources, but it was not have associated with any of the tenant. So the users are in your tenant and they can grant access on your Azure resources. So that's how it's going to work. I'm not going to click on change because I'm going to work with a subscription which I have already within this entire lab. I'm going to use the subscription mostly PaddyMaddy.onmicrosoft.com. This has already all the credits which I need to use for this lab. So I'm going to use within this lab the specific tenant. As a next step, we are going to verify our tenant with our proper domain name. So how I'm going to do is I'm going to my Azure Active Directory, and then if you see here, custom domain name. So from the custom domain name under from manage, you have an option called custom domain name. This is where I have to input by adding a custom domain name. So currently if you see here, it is configured as a primary. That means whatever user accounts I'm going to create, that's going to be with the username as the username at the rate PaddyMaddyLab.onmicrosoft.com. Instead of that, you need to log in with your own domain name. So for doing that, what I'm going to do is I'll simply click on add domain name. So I'll just enter here my custom domain name. So this is my custom domain name. leninmylab.com is my custom domain name. So I'll just input this name here. And once it's added, it's gonna ask me to either create a txt record or mx record, so either one of them. So I'm gonna actually create a txt record with these values. So I just already logged into Azure, into the GoDaddy portal, where I can manage my DNS management for this domain name, just to prove that this actually belongs to me, this domain. So I'm going to create a text record with the host as alias as @ and destination going to point with this value and TTL 360. So simple value. So I'll just click on add from records. Simply click on add. This record type is txt, host is @ it's going to point to ms equivalent, the value what it is showing there, and TTL default save. So that's it. Once you have done this, the steps almost the similar if you're not using GoDaddy or some other cheap name or whatever the DNS management console you're trying to use. It would be the similar fashion. What you have to do, once you have created, you can simply click on verify. Remember that these settings might take some time. Maybe it might take a hour or so sometimes, but since it's a GoDaddy, if you see here, it's just got failed to verify for now because I just clicked on an immediate basis. So it might take maybe as I said, 72 hours is the right time, what Microsoft or what Google Daddy or other DNS provider says. But these days, yes, it's just like 5-10 minutes work. So opposed to that, it would normally verify. Otherwise, you need to check with your DNS provider. I'm going to try one more time to verify since I waited some time. So this time it is successful, if you see here. And if I click here as the make primary, what would happen is the user accounts what we have tried to configure, that can be logged in with username @ on, instead of the on Microsoft.com, it will log in with the domain which we have verified just now as leninmylab.com. So I can click this button later point also, but let's click on make as a primary, click on yes. So this might take some time after post to the verify, simply click on close. So you see here now the leninmylab.com is verified and it has been added as the primary. So if I just go back to the users and try to create any user account like we created earlier, like in another tenant ID we created Chris. So let's try to create the same Chris, and you see here when I try to create, I get an option here as the leninmylab.com as the primary because the domain name is verified. Otherwise, you can also configure if the user want to just log in with on
Microsoft.com tenant, so you can use this also. So either way it works, and this is how you're gonna actually create the user accounts and post to the verification of your domain. So what we have learned so far is we understand about the tenant and domain verification and association of the trust between your tenant and your subscription, so that you can manage your subscriptions by granting some of the permissions from your tenant users like Chris we just created. So that concludes this lecture. I will see you in the next lecture. Thank you for watching this specific lecture. I hope you really enjoyed. Please take a minute to rate the course. Thank you.